London, 1814. Miss Lillian Hartley has nothing left. No dowry, no time. Her only chance? A proposal to the reclusive Duke of Ravenscroft. He needs a wife before his 35th birthday. She needs a way out. What begins as a contract may become something far more dangerous. A Duchess by Morning, a Regency romance audiobook begins now. Chapter 1. A Marriage of Necessity. London, 1816. Gabriel Ashbourne, Duke of Ravenscroft, did not turn at the sound of the door opening. He rarely needed to. People did not enter his presence uninvited. And yet Miss Lillian Hartley stepped across the threshold with the kind of composure that came not from confidence but from necessity. Her gown was a pale shade of periwinkle blue, modestly cut, the hem slightly worn but spotless. She had taken care, though the effort was subtle. Her gloves were mended, her slippers polished, her honey blonde hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, in a manner more practical than fashionable. A single curl had broken free to rest against her cheek, refusing to be tamed. She did not touch it. Her beauty was the kind that drew second glances, not for sparkle or scandal, but for its quiet symmetry. Clear violet eyes beneath arching brows, a softly pointed chin, and a mouth shaped by restraint rather than laughter. Not flashy, not powdered into submission, but undeniably striking. She looked neither cowed nor coquettish, merely steady. Gabriel turned slowly. His gaze swept over her once, his expression unreadable. "You asked for an audience," he said, his voice low and calm, like the surface of deep, still water. "I assume there is a reason." "There is, Your Grace," Lillian replied. She came to a stop several paces away, her hands folded before her. "I have come to propose marriage." A pause followed. The fire crackled. Gabriel blinked once. "I beg your pardon?" "Marriage," she repeated. "To you." The silence stretched thick, surreal. Then he spoke again. "Miss Hartley." He said the name as though tasting something unfamiliar. "I have had many things proposed to me. Marriage, however, is rarely so direct. I imagine most proposals you receive come from the ambitious mothers of desperate heiresses," she said not unkindly. That earned the faintest tilt of his head. "And yet you come alone." "Because I have no mother," she replied evenly, "and I am no heiress." Gabriel regarded her for a long moment, then turned to the sideboard. He poured a measure of brandy. The amber liquid caught the firelight as he raised the glass. But he did not drink. "You are Lady Margaret Hartley's daughter," he stated. "My father was Sir Edmund Hartley," she replied. "We had an estate in Lincolnshire. It is no longer ours." She hesitated, then added, "What remains is Hartley Cottage, small, and all that's left to my brother and me. So," he turned back to her, "a fallen family, a ruined estate, a desperate proposal." "Precisely," she replied. Gabriel's gaze sharpened. "And why me?" Lillian didn't look away. "Because you are unmarried, because your household is without a duchess, and because society says you must soon take one or face the consequences of scandal and speculation." Gabriel said nothing at first, but something subtle shifted in the air between them. His father's will came to mind, a clause he had tried to forget. If he remained unmarried by the age of 35, the trustees would gain control of Ravenscroft's more liquid assets. Not the land, but the leases, the investments, the funds, everything he needed to hold the estate together. And yet, she was beautiful. Not in the obvious, jeweled way of debutantes, but in a way that demanded second glances. That hair, honey blonde and softly swept back, caught the firelight like a crown. Those violet eyes met his without hesitation. It unsettled him, and he didn't care for that at all. He was 34. A respectable age for a duke to marry, according to society. A dangerous one, according to his father's will. "You are aware, I assume," he said slowly, "that dukes do not marry impoverished young ladies without dowries, fortune or consequence." "I am also aware," she said, "that dukes do not typically remain bachelors well into their 30s unless they have reason." That gave him pause. He set down the glass, still untouched, and stepped closer. "And what makes you think," he murmured, That I would choose you, Miss Hartley. She held her ground. Because I harbour no expectations, she said calmly. I do not seek affection, nor the approbation of society, nor, indeed, your fortune. I desire only the protection of your name for my younger brother's sake and my own. In return, you would have a wife who would neither intrude upon your affairs, nor lay claim to your time, nor betray your confidences, he observed, with no small interest, that she made no mention whatsoever of her beauty. You make it sound almost appealing, he said, voice bone dry. Lillian allowed herself the smallest smile. That was the intention. The clock chimed the half-hour. Gabriel studied her in silence, as if searching for some hidden flaw in her reasoning, or in her soul. You are either brave, he said at last, or mad. I have found, Lillian replied softly, that poverty often blurs the line between the two. Another pause, longer this time. Then Gabriel spoke, his voice clipped and decisive. Return tomorrow morning. At 8, we will marry in the drawing room, quietly, before society has time to sharpen its claws. Lillian's heart stuttered, but she only inclined her head. Yes, Your Grace. Gabriel turned back to the window as she curtsied and slipped silently from the room, leaving behind only the faint scent of rosewater and resolve. And for the first time in many years, the Duke of Ravenscroft found himself watching a door long after it had closed. It was not the wedding she'd imagined, not as a child, nor even as a desperate woman rehearsing possibilities in the dark of night. No bells rang, no flowers adorned the chapel, no well-wishers wept into embroidered handkerchiefs or fussed with her veil. There was, in fact, no veil at all. The drawing-room of Wyndham House, so formal and forbidding the day before, had been made slightly less so by the addition of a low arrangement of white lilies on a polished mahogany table. A thin shaft of morning light fell through the tall windows, striping the floor with soft gold. The fire had been lit early, and its quiet crackle was the only sound as Lillian stood at one end of the room. Alone, she wore a gown of ivory muslin, plain, borrowed and meticulously pressed. The hem bore signs of a hasty restitching. The sleeves had been altered to suit her slighter frame. It was neither new nor of any particular distinction, but it was clean. Her hair had been drawn back into a smooth chignon, secured with a modest pearl comb, her sole ornament. She had not broken her fast. Her gloves, slightly too small, pulled taut across her knuckles. Her hair had been drawn back into a smooth chignon, secured with a modest pearl comb, her sole ornament. She had not broken her fast. Her gloves, slightly too small, pulled taut across her knuckles. The Duke was late, not scandalously so, but enough to twist her stomach. The door opened. Lillian turned just as Gabriel entered. He wore a dark coat tailored to perfection, the lines of it crisp across his broad shoulders. Beneath it, a waistcoat threaded with silver shimmered faintly in the morning light, subtle, expensive, and effortlessly elegant. His cravat was knotted in precise folds of white silk, not ostentatious but meticulous. The cane he carried, a silver-headed piece more for form than function, clicked once against the polished parquet floor as he crossed the room with unhurried authority. He was tall, striking, the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he spoke a word. Raven dark hair, brushed neatly back, framed a face too sharply handsome to be called kind. Angular jaw, high brow, and eyes the colour of winter stone, grey, clear, unreadable. Lillian held her ground, and yet she felt the air change with his arrival. 2 footmen lingered discreetly in the hall, summoned to serve as witnesses, though neither met the bride's eye. That was all. No family, no fanfare, only the necessary forms, observed in silence. Miss Hartley, the Duke said quietly. Your Grace, she replied, curtsying. Their eyes met. There was no smile, no softness, only a flicker of acknowledgement. 2 strangers about to become something legally and irrevocably intertwined. Shall we begin? The clergyman asked gently. They stood before the fire, 2 silhouettes in the pale light. The vows were simple, spoken without hesitation. When asked if she took this man, Lillian answered without a tremor. When asked if he took this woman, Gabriel's pause was nearly imperceptible. But then, I do. He slipped a ring onto her gloved finger. Gold. Simple, heavy, and it was done. By the power vested in me. The clergyman's voice faded into the background as the words wife and duchess settled around her like a new gown not yet broken in. She felt the weight of them at her throat. They did not kiss. Of course not. Instead, Gabriel turned to the vicar and said quietly, "You may go." Within moments, they were alone. The fire hissed softly. Lillian resisted the urge to flex her fingers beneath her gloves. "Then, thank you for your punctuality," he said at last. It might have been sarcasm, had his tone not been so dry. She inclined her head. "And thank you for your expediency." A flicker just there, at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. He moved to the window, hands behind his back. "I imagine this arrangement will be the subject of much curiosity." "I expect so," she replied. "You will receive an allowance." He spoke without turning. "You may furnish yourself with whatever is required for your position. My steward will see to the details." "Very well," she replied. "Your brother will remain at Hartley Cottage," he said quietly. "I've instructed my solicitor to settle the debts and ensure he is properly provided for." That caught her off guard. She blinked. "I thank you." He turned then, and for the first time his eyes were on her. Not with calculation, but with something closer to curiosity. "You are remarkably calm," he said, watching her closely. "I had several hours to prepare," she replied, her voice even. He paused. "Most women would have cried." Another flicker. Interest, perhaps. "I will not interfere with your days," he said, "nor expect you to occupy mine. You may entertain as you like. The staff will assist you." "And at night?" Her voice was low, careful. His eyes narrowed. "I mean only," she added, evenly, "that we might establish expectations, boundaries. I assume this marriage does not require consummation." His jaw tightened. "Not unless you desire it." "I do not." A beat of silence. "Very well," he said. Lillian folded her hands before her, willing her pulse to slow. "Do you ride?" he asked abruptly. She blinked. "Not well. You'll need to learn. My estate in Sussex is more rural than London. We depart this afternoon." A pause. "Today?" "Unless you prefer to remain here, among prying eyes and wagging tongues." Her spine straightened. "No, I would rather not." He nodded once. "Then we shall leave at 4. She curtsied again. Lower this time. "As you wish, Your Grace." He turned back to the window. And so, with the ceremony behind them, they left London behind as well. The carriage was a Ravenscroft original, sleek, black lacquered, and emblazoned with a silver crest so subtly worked into the panelling, it shimmered only in certain light. Inside, it was warm and quiet, lined with dark blue velvet and polished walnut trim. The wheels barely murmured on the road, and yet Lillian had never felt so acutely every jolt, every turn, every mile. Across from her sat her husband, the Duke. She did not know whether to call him Gabriel. She rather doubted he'd like it. They had not spoken since departing Wyndham House, not beyond a polite exchange of travel necessities. Did she require a lap blanket? No. Would she prefer to stop before dark? Also no. Now he sat with one gloved hand resting on his thigh, the other curled around a leather-bound book he had not opened. His cravat was still perfectly tied, his expression still unreadable. Lillian turned to the window, watching the city fall away, cobbled streets giving way to meadows, hedgerows, and eventually the misty rise of Sussex hills. The light faded slowly, until the carriage lamps cast long shadows, and the evening settled around them like a second skin. It was near dusk when the carriage finally passed through wrought-iron gates and onto a long, tree-lined drive. Ravenscroft Hall rose before them like something out of legend, a vast stone manor, its grey facade softened by ivy and centuries of English rain, with mullioned windows glowing faintly from within. Towers flanked either side like silent sentinels. It was beautiful in its own way, but also formidable. A house built to last through war, through scandal, through silence. As they pulled to a stop, footmen appeared, as if conjured from mist. The carriage door opened. A stair was lowered. Gabriel descended first, offering her his hand. She hesitated only a second before placing her gloved fingers in his. His grip was steady, warm. She stepped down, the evening wind catching the hem of her travelling cloak, sending it fluttering like a banner behind her. The front doors opened. Lamps flickered. A butler, spare and silver-haired, bowed low. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "And Your Grace," he said it to her, with only the slightest pause. "Thank you, Holloway," Gabriel said. "Has everything been arranged?" "Yes, Your Grace. Lady Ravenscroft's chambers are prepared." Lillian's stomach gave a small twist at the sound of that title. It felt heavy, ill-fitting, like a crown set too firmly on a head not yet used to its weight. They entered the hall, stone-flagged, high-ceilinged, the scent of beeswax and old roses lingering in the air. Tapestries lined the walls. A fire burned low in the central hearth. Shadows danced up into the arches. "Dinner will be served in an hour," the butler said. "Shall I instruct the staff to assist Her Grace in dressing?" Gabriel glanced at Lillian, his expression unreadable. "Would you prefer to dine alone?" he asked, his tone polite. Lillian hesitated. Every instinct told her to retreat, to unpack in silence, to sit at a small writing desk and eat a quiet meal by the hearth. "No, if you will dine, I will dine." "Of course, Your Grace," Holloway replied, bowing. "I shall inform the kitchen as well." Gabriel turned slightly toward the waiting footman. "Holloway will see that you're shown up. Your chambers are at the top of the west wing staircase," he said. "A lady's maid has been arranged. If you find anything lacking, you may speak to Holloway or Mrs. Price." "Thank you," Lillian replied. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps quiet but unhurried, as he crossed the hall toward the east wing, toward whatever room he had chosen for himself. She watched him go, and for the first time since she had offered him her hand in marriage, Lillian Hartley, Duchess of Ravenscroft, felt not relief, but something far more dangerous. Alone. Chapter 2. A Bride in the Shadows. The sun had barely crested the trees when Lillian woke in her new chambers alone. The room was vast, far larger than anything she had ever occupied, and yet she could not shake the sensation that it had been prepared for someone else. Perhaps it had. The walls were hung in soft damask, a faded shade of rose, and the four-poster bed was carved with climbing vines and crowned with a canopy of gauze. Her trunks had been neatly unpacked, books shelved, slippers aligned, gowns hung in a wardrobe so tall she would need a stool to reach the top rail. There wasn't much. Just a few well-kept dresses, a stack of worn novels, and the small, sensible things a woman brought when she expected to be tolerated, not cherished. Still, the room felt enormous. Someone had placed a breakfast tray by the window. She crossed the room in bare feet, her wrapper tied tightly at her waist, and gazed out onto a world of mist and meadow. Ravenscroft Hall sat on the edge of a vast Sussex valley. In the distance, green rolled into blue. A line of trees marked the beginning of forest. The tray held tea, a boiled egg, and a currant bun still warm enough to scent the air. There was also a small pot of jam, a folded linen napkin, and a delicate porcelain cup filled with rich, dark chocolate. The scent curled up to meet her. Warm, spiced, and utterly unexpected. The quiet luxury of it, the care, startled her more than any grandeur might have. She had half expected a cold crust and an empty hallway. She broke the bun in half and spread a little jam across the soft center. It stained the bread like ruby silk. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth. A knock at the door drew her back. It opened to reveal a young woman in a simple grey dress, her cap neat, her expression cautious. "Good morning, Your Grace. I'm Bess. His Grace asked that I be assigned to you." Lillian blinked. "Your Grace." The title still sat strange in her ears. "Thank you, Bess. That's very kind." The maid bobbed a curtsy and entered the room with the brisk confidence of someone used to quiet efficiency. "I've laid out the day gown Mrs. Price recommended for the morning," the maid said. "The dark lavender one with the pearl buttons. She thought it best until the dressmaker arrives." Lillian glanced at the bed, where her gown had been laid out. Someone had pressed it carefully. She folded her hands. "The dressmaker?" "Yes, Your Grace," the maid replied. "His Grace sent word last night. She's expected before luncheon." Lillian nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure why. When the maid curtsied and withdrew, silence returned like a second skin. She turned back to the gown. Simple, serviceable, spotless, and smoothed a hand over the fabric, so she would be fitted for something finer. Change had arrived sooner than expected. Ravenscroft Hall was a world unto itself. Corridors stretched in long, hushed lines, lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. The ceilings were high, the walls thick with tapestries that whispered faintly when the air stirred. She passed an empty music room, a locked door with no keyhole, and a gallery of faded watercolours she could not help but pause to admire. A few rooms bore the look of disuse, dust gathering at the edges of rugs, sheets drawn over furniture. Others were spotless, like a house too proud to reveal its aging bones. It was nearly noon before Lillian encountered him again. She had wandered through half the West Wing by then, cataloguing long galleries, velvet settees in unused salons, and more portraits of Ashbournes than she could count. Stern-faced men in crimson sashes, powdered ladies with unreadable expressions and glittering eyes, all of them silent, watching, waiting. At last, she descended a narrow staircase and turned into what must once have been a breakfast room, small by Ravenscroft standards, though grand by any other. A round mahogany table sat beneath an unlit chandelier. Pale green wallpaper, patterned with acanthus leaves, framed a pair of open French doors. Beyond them, white roses stirred on a flagstone terrace. And there he was. The Duke. He sat alone, a tea service half drunk before him, one hand loosely around a porcelain cup. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind. His expression, as ever, gave nothing away. He did not rise, but he looked at her directly, clearly. "You walk quietly," he said. "I wasn't aware I needed to announce myself. The halls carry sound. You don't. I'm told that's admirable in a wife." One brow lifted. "So it is." She stepped further into the room, careful not to brush the table. "I didn't expect to find you here. I might say the same." He gestured to the second cup. "Tea? Is that an invitation? Or a test?" His mouth twitched. "You're quick. For someone who spent the morning lost in my house." "I wasn't lost, only observing." "And what did you observe?" "That your ancestors were very fond of themselves." He exhaled. Not quite a laugh, but close. It startled her. She sat opposite him and accepted the tea. The blend was delicate, jasmine, with something citrus beneath. A sliver of lemon waited in a silver dish. "I hope your rooms are adequate," he said. "They're lovely," she replied. "Though I wonder if the rose damask was a deliberate choice." He glanced over. "It feels bridal." A faint smile. "They were my mother's. I haven't changed them." "I see," she sipped. "Then they're perfectly appropriate." As is the silence. His voice dropped slightly. "Most things I do are deliberate, Lady Ravenscroft." The title made her shoulders tighten, though she tried not to show it. "I'm still becoming accustomed to that name." "It suits you." She glanced at him. "Just once. I don't flatter," he added. "I'd already assumed as much." She took another sip. Silence returned, softer now, but still not comfortable. Outside, white roses shifted in the breeze. After a moment, she asked, "Do you intend to remain here long, or shall we return to London?" "That depends." "On what?" He met her gaze. "On whether you prefer the lies of society to the quiet of the countryside." She set her cup down with care. "Some women thrive on whispers," he continued, "on being seen, envied." "I've had enough of whispers," she said. "I'd rather be useful." He studied her. "You're not what I expected." "I'm sure I'm not." A beat. "I'll be riding at 4, if the weather holds. You're welcome to join me." "I don't ride well," she said cautiously. "You can learn. And if I fall?" He held her gaze. "Then I'll know where to find you." A flicker crossed her face. Surprise, perhaps amusement. She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Very well, I'll ride. You surprise me, Lady Ravenscroft. I suspect we shall surprise each other more than once." She left the room without looking back. Behind her, the Duke sat very still, his tea cooling in his hand, and something unreadable in his storm-grey eyes. The riding habit had arrived that morning. Navy wool, sharply tailored with polished brass buttons and a matching hat. Lillian had tried not to wonder when it had been ordered, or how Gabriel had known her measurements. It fit perfectly, which was somehow more unsettling than if it hadn't. The stables of Ravenscroft Hall sat behind a stone wall softened by moss and honeysuckle, as Lillian approached with her new maid, Bess. The scent of hay, leather, and fresh earth reached her on the breeze. The horses, glossy and well-groomed, stamped and whickered in their stalls. Grooms moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting tack, brushing coats, murmuring commands. The Duke stood at the centre of the yard, already mounted, a magnificent black stallion beneath him. His coat, charcoal grey today, fit snug over his broad shoulders. His gloved hand rested lightly on the reins. He looked entirely at ease in the saddle, as though carved there. "You're late," he said, as she emerged. "I'm terrified," she replied, lifting her chin. He gave the faintest nod to the stable boy beside her, who stepped forward with a smaller, chestnut mare, already saddled. "She's called Poppy," the boy said. "Gentle as they come, Your Grace." Lillian eyed the saddle. "I'm not at all sure this is a good idea." "Then it's exactly the kind of idea worth attempting," Gabriel said, motioning for the boy to assist her. With no small amount of awkwardness and a great deal of fabric shifting, she mounted. He watched her, his expression as ever, utterly unreadable. She adjusted her posture. "If I die, you'll be left with a moderately clever ghost who judges your breakfast choices." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," he replied, "only bad conversationalists." They rode in silence for a time, past green meadows and into a trail lined with low stone walls and overgrown hedges. The breeze played with the edge of Lillian's hat, and the rhythmic motion of the horse was enough to calm her nerves, slightly. Gabriel rode ahead, then alongside, offering no unnecessary words. But when her horse startled at a rabbit and Lillian gave a small yelp, he was beside her in a moment, hand out, not quite touching her arm, but ready. "You said she was gentle," she muttered. "She is." The rabbit, however, was rude. A soft, startled laugh escaped her, and he blinked as if he hadn't expected the sound. By the time they returned to the hall, the sun hung lower in the sky, and the wind carried the first hint of evening chill. The grooms came forward to take their mounts. Lillian turned to her husband. "I didn't fall." "No," he said. "You didn't." She looked up at him. "You're disappointed." His mouth quirked. Barely. Only mildly. She hesitated, then added, "The habit is." She glanced down, letting her fingers brush one of the polished brass buttons. "Quite fine. It was not kindness," he said simply. "It was necessity. You are the Duchess of Ravenscroft now. You must look the part." Lillian studied the cut of the fabric, the stitching too precise to be accidental. So this was what marriage to a duke required. Appearances, composure, silk over stone. She lifted her chin. "Then I suppose I'm already halfway there." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. Later that evening, dinner was served in the smaller dining room, a more intimate space, panelled in dark oak and lit by two elegant candelabras, their flames mirrored in the glow of a fire, banked low in the hearth. Lillian had changed into one of her own gowns, a dove-grey muslin, freshly pressed, with a modest neckline and long sleeves. A faded ribbon cinched the waist, and someone, likely a maid, had taken the time to mend the stitching at the hem. Her hair was pinned higher than usual, with a single curled strand resting against the nape of her neck. It wasn't silk, but it would do. She looked composed, elegant, a duchess in form, if not yet in spirit. The Duke was already seated. As she took her place across from him, the footman stepped forward to pour the wine. Claret, deep and rich. Another placed the first course before her. Roasted quail in a red currant glaze, served atop a delicate brioche, with fine herbs scattered in elegant lines across the porcelain. On the side, glazed carrots in honey, and a creamy parsnip soup laced with nutmeg. Lillian's eyes widened slightly. "I confess," she said, unfolding her napkin. "I expected something simpler. My cook is French," the Duke replied. Exile has not dulled his ambition, nor his skill. He watched her take a bite. He did not smile, but he did watch. Next came steamed salmon with lemon butter, served alongside braised fennel and a salad of watercress and orange slices. then warm cheese tarts, delicate as clouds, and finally figs poached in cinnamon and port, served with cream and a drizzle of dark honey. Lillian ate slowly, savouring each bite. In truth, she was starving, but dignity would not permit her to devour anything too quickly. Gabriel, she noticed, ate sparingly, as though food were a formality, something to be endured, not enjoyed. "You don't enjoy your meals," she said quietly. He glanced up. "I enjoy watching people who do." She hesitated. "I imagine you watch many people, fewer than you think." Silence settled again, but it was warmer now, less brittle. When the final dish was cleared, he rose. "I'll be in the East Library, if you require anything. And if I don't, then we may consider the evening a success." He inclined his head, then turned and disappeared into the shadowed corridor beyond. Lillian remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. The candles flickered in the draught from the hall. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. She was full. She was dressed in her best. She was married to a man she barely knew, and tomorrow she would wake in a house where the past breathed louder than the present. But for now, she reached for the final fig left on her plate and savoured it slowly. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Ballroom. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, sealed with red wax, and the unmistakable crest of Lady Trenwith, matron of fashion, gossip, and the town's most exclusive events. Her soirees were not merely social gatherings, they were strategic battlegrounds, where alliances were formed, reputations tested, and secrets hinted at behind fluttering fans and glinting jewels. Lillian turned the envelope over twice before breaking the seal. "You are cordially invited to Lady Trenwith's assembly." She read the lines slowly. Then again, a deep unease stirred in her stomach. The Duke read the invitation in silence, then set it aside. "She wastes no time," he said. "You know her? She's a friend of my aunt, and a collector of scandal. Then why would she invite me?" A pause. "She's curious," he replied. "You're a new Duchess. Unexpected, untried. London wants a glimpse. And do you intend to give them one?" His gaze found hers. "Yes." 3 days later, the London staff was in a quiet frenzy of preparation. Gowns were pressed, gloves laid out, and the modiste summoned for final fittings. Dresses arrived in layers of silk and tissue paper. Jewels were unpacked. There were slippers in soft kidskin, new gloves of ivory silk, and a spray of diamond hairpins delivered in a velvet box without a note. Lillian stared at them, the sunlight catching on each stone like drops of fire. From him, she thought, but of course, he had said nothing. The night of the ball, she dressed slowly. Her gown was deep garnet silk, rich as red wine, the colour chosen by the modiste, who claimed it brought out the fire in her hair and the violet in her eyes. The bodice was fitted and finely boned, the neckline daringly low and off the shoulders, edged in intricate beadwork that shimmered with pearls and silver thread. Her stays had been laced tighter than she preferred, shaping her waist with exacting precision. Her sleeves, short and adorned with delicate fringe, left her arms bare to the elbow, save for a pair of sheer lace gloves. Her hair had been swept up to bare the curve of her throat, where the Ravenscroft diamonds lay like starlight on skin. The diamonds had arrived just before dusk, a necklace of old cut stones. Gabriel had delivered them himself, saying only, "You'll need these, they'll expect it." Then he turned and left, without waiting for her reply. She wore them now. The necklace, a cascade of silver-set diamonds, lay heavy against her skin, while the hairpins glimmered like starlight in her blonde hair. When she descended the staircase, the house silent around her, she found Gabriel waiting at the bottom. He was dressed in a midnight black tailcoat over a crisp ivory waistcoat, his cravat tied with impeccable precision, a pale slash of elegance at his throat. His dark hair had been brushed back from his brow, the candlelight catching in its waves. He looked up at the sound of her step and froze. For a moment, he simply stared. The garnet silk clung to her like candlelight, elegant, striking, impossible to ignore. The diamonds at her throat gleamed against pale skin, and yet it wasn't the gown, or the jewels, or the careful way her hair had been pinned. It was her composure, the way she stood, as if the title already belonged to her, and always had. Something in his expression shifted, the faintest narrowing of his eyes, a quiet breath, as though the sight of her had knocked the air from his chest, and he hadn't yet decided what to do about it. He hadn't expected that. "They will talk," he said at last, voice low. "Let them," she replied. A pause. Something in his tone softened. "You're not afraid?" "I am," she said honestly, "but I'll still walk in beside you." Another flicker passed through his expression, this time unmistakable, not surprise. "Awe." He offered his arm. She took it, and together they stepped into the waiting carriage and rode toward the glittering lion's den. Lady Trenwith's ballroom blazed with light. Candles burned in towering chandeliers, each flame reflected in endless gilt mirrors. The floor shone like glass. The air smelled of roses, orange blossom, beeswax and ambition. Lillian paused just beyond the threshold. A sea of silks and feathers, jewels and lace, stretched before her. A violin sang above the swell of conversation. At the top of the stairs, a footman stepped forward, his voice carrying over the room. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft. Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Heads turned, fans stilled. "The Duchess of Ravenscroft," someone whispered, this time, with malice. Lillian took a breath, collected herself, then stepped forward. Eyes followed them, some with admiration, others with speculation. Lillian felt the weight of the Ravenscroft diamonds, the smoothness of her gloves, the tension in the Duke's arm beneath hers. She moved like she belonged. She did not. At the base of the staircase, a pair of women leaned together, powdered, painted, dripping with jewels. "No dowry," one murmured. "A country girl," the other replied. "Did you hear? Her father died bankrupt, and yet a duchess." They did not lower their voices. Lillian lifted her chin. Gabriel heard them too. She knew by the tightness of his jaw. He said nothing, but he did not release her arm. Then suddenly, she heard it. "Duchess!" Lillian turned. A woman stood before her, tall, impossibly poised, and unmistakably aware of the effect she had on a room. Lady Evangeline DeWitt. Her gown was silver and smoke, cut from silk satin that shimmered like moonlight on steel. The bodice clung with precision, its embroidery of silver thread and jet beading catching the light in sharp, deliberate flashes. The neckline dipped just low enough to draw the eye, framed by a collar of black lace like a shadow at her throat. The skirts moved with her like liquid, hemmed in frost-toned lace and trailing just enough to command attention. Her black hair was swept into a towering coiffure, glossy as polished obsidian, threaded with pearls and crowned with a plume of white feathers. It was a display of rank and power, styled to draw the eye upward and hold it there. Her eyes, a piercing, predatory green, were heavily lidded and impossible to ignore. Her mouth, perfectly painted, curved with the faintest suggestion of amusement or appetite. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, honed, gleaming, and dangerous to touch. Her smile was flawless, and it was not kind. "How lovely," she said, brushing the air beside each of Lillian's cheeks in a gesture that suggested intimacy, and confirmed the lack of it. "We haven't been introduced, have we? I'm Lady DeWitt. I've heard quite a bit." Lillian returned her smile, perfectly polite. "Then allow me to provide the rest." Evangeline turned to Gabriel, her fingers trailing lightly across his sleeve, too casually to be accidental. "Gabriel, how well you look." He bowed. "Lady DeWitt." Lillian felt his arm tighten beneath hers, but he didn't move away. "You've done well for yourself," Evangeline murmured, eyes flicking back to Lillian. Such a refreshing match. Lillian held her gaze. "It wasn't luck." Evangeline's smile sharpened. "I'm sure it wasn't." Then, with a laugh like broken glass, Evangeline drifted into the crowd, graceful, effortless, impossible to ignore. Lillian said nothing. Neither did Gabriel, but his eyes followed Evangeline as she went, not hungrily, not longingly, just long enough. And for the first time, Lillian felt it. Not jealousy, exactly, something colder. "Is she always the center of the room?" Lillian asked softly. Gabriel didn't look at her. "She makes certain of it," he replied. "She's very beautiful." He said nothing at first. Then, after a pause, "Yes." Lillian turned her gaze back toward the crowd. "You cared for her." There was a silence, longer this time. Waited. Finally, Gabriel answered, his voice low. "I did." Another pause, slower, heavier. Lillian's voice was quiet, careful. "Do you still?" This time, he met her eyes. His expression did not shift. "No." The word rang cleanly between them, unchanged by hesitation, softened by nothing. But still, Lillian felt the shadow of doubt settle in her chest. He had answered with certainty, and yet she could not quite believe him, and somehow, that was worse. The supper bell was rung, and the ballroom began to shift. Gentlemen offered arms, fans snapped open, and ladies glided toward the great hall, where gold-rimmed dishes and sparkling wine waited. And as they passed beneath the glittering chandeliers toward the feast, her smile was perfectly practiced. But behind her teeth, something small and defiant began to burn. The supper room was a long gallery lined with candlelight, golden mirrors, and the mingling scents of roses, polished wood, and rich, warm food. The table extended nearly the full length of the grand hall, a glittering expanse of polished mahogany, crowned with silver epeons and the soft glow of beeswax candles. Crystal decanters caught the light in sharp, glinting angles, while mirrored trays reflected the flicker of flame like starlight. Lavish platters ran the length of the cloth, each dish a testament to culinary opulence. Beside each place setting, a tall flute of sparkling wine caught the firelight, the bubbles rising steadily, like laughter trapped in crystal. Lillian was seated beside Gabriel, of course, but directly across from Lady Evangeline, who greeted her with a smile that might have cut glass. "My dear Duchess," Evangeline said, unfolding her napkin with theatrical grace. "You must be exhausted. So much attention is a heavy thing to bear, is it not?" Lillian met her gaze evenly. Only if one's foundation is poorly built. Evangeline's lips curved. Indeed, but some foundations were never meant for the weight of such titles. So fragile, some things. Before Lillian could reply, Gabriel spoke, quietly, but with unmistakable steel. "Careful, Lady DeWitt. You're mistaking spite for wit, and I doubt the room is fooled." The table stilled, just for a breath. Then conversation resumed, a little too brightly, like the clinking of glass after an awkward silence. Evangeline laughed, brittle and lovely. "Touché, Your Grace." She turned her eyes back to Lillian. "Still, I do envy you. Such freshness, such simplicity. I imagine every day with the Duke is a revelation. Some days pass more easily than others," she said mildly. "It depends who's in the room." A nearby gentleman dropped his fork. Gabriel's mouth twitched, just slightly. Not a smile exactly, but not far from it. Lillian ate slowly, mindful of posture, of gaze, of the eyes she knew still lingered on her from across the room. Eventually Evangeline rose, graceful as a falling petal, and drifted toward the card room, trailing admirers like smoke in her wake. Lillian exhaled quietly. "You held your ground," Gabriel murmured beside her. "She tried to drag it out from under me. She didn't manage it." She glanced at him. "Do you wish I'd been quiet?" "No." He took a sip of wine. She needed reminding. Of what? He looked at her then, and for once there was no barrier in his expression, only clarity. "That I don't regret marrying you." Her breath caught. Not enough to be visible, but enough. They sat in companionable silence until the final toast was made. Glasses were raised, smiles painted on. As the guests rose and began to return to the ballroom, Gabriel stood and offered his arm once more. This time, she took it without hesitation, and as they re-entered the light of the ballroom, the music swelling around them, Lillian felt the shape of something new beginning to form. Not love, not yet, but something honest, something real, not born of obligation, but chosen. Chapter 4. Secrets at Ravenscroft Hall. The journey back to Sussex was a quiet one. Lillian sat across from Gabriel, hands folded over her gloves, trying not to dwell on the ball or the way he had looked at her across the supper table. They did not speak. Not about the dance, not about Evangeline, not about the things that might have been said if either of them had known what to call what was slowly forming between them. By the time they reached Ravenscroft Hall, the lamps were being lit against the early dusk. The house looked much as it always had. Elegant, orderly, intimidating in its size, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was her, or the silence between them, or the growing sense that this marriage, whatever it had begun as, was becoming something far more complicated. Inside, the fire had been lit in the front hall. Bess greeted her with a curtsy and a warming pan for the bed. "Shall I bring tea to your rooms?" "No, thank you. I think I'll walk for a little while." The journey was long. Bess hesitated, then nodded. "Very good, Your Grace." Lillian wandered through the west side of the house without much purpose, content to stretch her legs and settle her thoughts. She passed a wide staircase she hadn't taken before and followed it to a hallway she did not immediately recognize. The floor here was quieter, less used. The doors were older. The walls were hung with fewer paintings. She might have turned back, if not for the door at the end of the corridor, standing just slightly open. She approached out of curiosity more than intent, and when she pushed it gently open, she found a room that felt suspended in time. It was a bedroom, tidy, but clearly unused. The bed was narrow, made up with dark blue linens. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books and small carved figurines. A desk sat near the window, an inkwell and a few scattered pages still resting there, yellowed but carefully arranged. It wasn't eerie, just untouched. A young man's room, left precisely as it had been. On the dresser, she saw a letter peeking out from beneath a book. It had been folded neatly and addressed in a hand she didn't recognize. She didn't open it, only turned it slightly, and read the signature at the bottom. Julian Ashbourne. Her heart gave a small, quiet jolt. She'd heard the name, Gabriel's younger brother. No, not younger, his twin. Whispers in London spoke of a tragedy years ago, but never the details. Only a vague, respectful silence surrounding the name. She set the letter down carefully, meaning to leave it undisturbed. But when she turned, she startled to find Gabriel standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry, not precisely, but his posture was rigid, and his gaze fixed on the letter in her hand. "This part of the house is not open," he said quietly. "I didn't know," she replied. The door was open. He stepped inside, took the letter gently from her hands, and tucked it into his coat. His expression remained unreadable. "I didn't read it," she said quickly. "I know," he said quietly. She hesitated. "This was your brother's room?" Gabriel nodded once. "Julian," she said softly. "I saw his name in the gallery. I heard you were twins." "We were." He glanced around the room, not with sentiment, but with something closer to restraint, like a man remembering how to breathe. "He died here?" she asked. Gabriel nodded again. "It was years ago now. I'm sorry," she said. "I am too." They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then, more gently than before, he said, "There's nothing here that will help you understand me, Lillian." She looked at him. "I didn't come looking for answers. I was only walking." Another pause. "I believe you," he said. She nodded and moved to the door. "Don't come back here," he added, not coldly, but quietly. "I won't," she said, and she meant it. Not because of what she had seen, but because of what she hadn't, because some silences didn't need filling, and some grief was never meant to be shared. The next morning passed in careful silence. She did not see Gabriel at breakfast, nor in the hall, nor during her walk along the gravel paths that edged the garden. The morning air was brisk, touched with a damp chill, and the sky hung low with a dull pewter haze. Lillian walked without purpose, gloved hands tucked into her sleeves, the hem of her cloak whispering through the grass. She wasn't ashamed of where she had wandered the night before, but she had been changed by it. Not because she'd uncovered some hidden truth, but because she had seen the outline of something long buried, and understood, for the first time, that her husband carried more weight than he allowed the world to see, and perhaps more than he could bear alone. Gabriel did not appear until just after midday. She found him in the small morning room, standing by the window with one hand braced on the sill, the other holding a book loosely at his side. The light caught along his profile, sharp and thoughtful. At the sound of her steps, he turned, but made no move to close the distance. Lillian hesitated at the door. He nodded toward the chair opposite. "You're not unwelcome." She stepped inside and took the seat, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "I didn't go back. I know, and I won't. I know that too." A pause stretched between them. Soft, weighty. "I'm sorry," she added, not only for intruding, but for what it brought back. Gabriel closed the book gently and looked at her. Julian was light in every room. He made people laugh. He rarely took anything seriously. "Not like me." Lillian's voice was low. That doesn't mean he wasn't serious in his own way. He looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. No one else ever thought to say that. She didn't press him. She simply let the silence settle again. Unthreatening. "After he died," Gabriel said, "they began speaking to me as if I were made of glass. Or worse, as if I wasn't supposed to feel anything at all. Lillian met his gaze. And what do you want them to believe? He looked away. That I'm not a story they get to rewrite. A while later, a tray was brought to the morning room. A light luncheon, arranged without fanfare. There was a dish of warm, crusty rolls wrapped in linen, a tureen of chicken consommé fragrant with tarragon and thyme, and a platter of cold poached salmon garnished with dill and paper-thin slices of cucumber. On a smaller plate sat lemon tarts, their tops caramelized to a delicate gold. Lillian poured the tea herself, steadying the pot with practiced hands. Gabriel accepted his cup without comment. Though his fingers brushed hers in the exchange, she noticed it. He didn't acknowledge it, and perhaps that was all right for now. Later that night, rain had begun to fall. Soft, steady drops that traced slow paths down the window panes and gathered on the stone sills. She stood at the windows for some time, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the rain beyond the glass. She hadn't expected him to come, not after the letter, not after the things left unspoken between them. But when the door opened and Gabriel stepped inside, she didn't turn away. She only shifted slightly, enough to give him space beside her. He stopped a few paces behind. "It's late," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep," she replied without turning. "You often can't?" "Only when there's too much on my mind." He said nothing to that. He didn't need to. A beat of quiet stretched between them. Then, his voice low, "Would you sit with me? Just for a moment?" She turned to face him. He wasn't offering his arm, just the space beside him on the low settee near the fire. She walked across the room without hesitation, and sat. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had become something else. A kind of ease, edged with restraint. There was a decanter on the side table, its contents a deep amber. Beside it, 2 small crystal glasses had been set out, unused. He poured a small measure of brandy into each glass, a quiet offering before bed. She accepted the glass, fingers brushing his. The glass was smooth and cool in her hand, the scent of oak and spice rising faintly. He didn't raise his, only sat beside her, the firelight casting soft shadows along the curve of his jaw. His sleeve brushed her wrist. "Thank you," she murmured. "You shouldn't be cold," he said, his gaze dropping to the edge of her shawl. "There's a fire in every room. Warmth and comfort are not the same thing," she said quietly. He leaned back slightly, eyes unreadable. "And which do you find here?" "Something in between," she said. "It depends on the hour." That pulled the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but a sign he'd heard her. For a while, they didn't speak. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed once, then again. She glanced toward the far side of the room. "There's a piano in the drawing room. Has anyone played it recently?" Gabriel's brow lifted. "Not for some time." "It's beautifully kept," she said quietly. "Someone must care about it." Gabriel set his glass down. "You notice more than you say." Lillian met his gaze. "And you say far less than you should." He glanced toward the hearth. Julian played. So did I. But once he was gone, the piano felt hollow, as if the heart had gone out of it. Lillian didn't rush to fill the quiet. After a moment, she said, "Would you play for me?" Gabriel didn't move. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it mattered," she added gently. His reply was almost inaudible. "You assume I remember how. I think you remember more than you want to." His eyes flicked toward her, sharp, assessing. But again, he said nothing. The fire had burned low by the time she rose to go. He didn't stand. But he did speak, just before she reached the door. "You asked me once what I wanted people to believe." She turned slightly. He didn't look at her. "I want them to believe I feel nothing," he said. "Because if they believe that, they don't ask what I've lost." Lillian regarded him for a long, quiet moment. "Then you've chosen the wrong wife," she said. And with that, she left the room, soft-footed and steady, leaving behind only the faint scent of brandy and the echo of something true. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Caller. The letter arrived mid-morning, carried by a liveried rider whose boots left streaks of wet across the stone steps. Gabriel read it alone in the study, then stood for a long while, the letter crushed slightly between his fingers. When he emerged, Lillian was seated in the drawing room, her embroidery untouched on her lap. She looked up at once. "A visitor is coming," he said, She raised her brows. One of yours? Gabriel gave a short nod. Lord Halberton. He'll arrive by tomorrow. Lillian hesitated. She had heard the name. Everyone had. He's an old friend of your family. He's not a friend, Gabriel said carefully. He was my father's ally, my advisor once, and now? He's a reminder. Of what? Gabriel didn't answer. He only looked out the window for a long moment, then added, He'll stay 2 nights, you should be prepared. For what? This time, he met her eyes. He doesn't believe I should have married you. Lillian's voice stayed steady. Because I wasn't born into your world, because you weren't the sort of woman he would have chosen, or approved, he said, without flinching. She rose then, folding her embroidery in one smooth motion. Then I'll just have to prove him wrong. Lord Bertram Halberton arrived in a black barouche, flanked by a single outrider and trailed by a trunk strapped in leather. He was a tall man with a hawkish face, white hair slicked back, and sharp eyes that gave the impression of seeing every crack in a wall or a person. He greeted Gabriel with a firm handshake, and no smile. When introduced to Lillian, he bowed but shallowly. Your Grace, he said, and somehow made the title sound like a test. Lillian curtsied, her chin lifted. My lord. He said nothing further. Instead, he turned to Gabriel and remarked, The place hasn't changed. Gabriel's tone was cool. Some things aren't meant to. Halberton glanced at the walls, his mouth tightening. Others outlive their welcome. They walked in, coats trailing behind them like banners of old alliances, and Lillian followed, silent, steady. That evening, dinner was laid in the formal dining hall for the first time since their wedding. Lillian sat at the head of the long table, opposite Gabriel. Halberton took a seat midway down the table between them. Though the distance made conversation strained, he seemed perfectly at ease, as if the house and its arrangements still revolved around him. The first course arrived, oxtail consommé, clear and deeply aromatic, with a swirl of parsley and thinly sliced carrots. Halberton sipped once, then set down his spoon. I confess, he said, not looking at Gabriel, I thought you'd leave this place behind entirely. There was talk of you selling. Gabriel gave a faint shrug. There is always talk, he said. Is that your wife's doing then? Halberton asked. The reason you've remained here at all? Gabriel's hand paused on his glass. She prefers quiet, he said evenly. Halberton turned to her. Do you? Lillian met his gaze without blinking. I prefer purpose. The older man leaned back in his chair. And what purpose do you serve here? Your Grace. Lillian lifted her napkin and placed it carefully on her lap. I keep the house from falling silent. I speak with the housekeeper. I learn what I can. I read. I ride. And I share my days with a man who carries more than most would ever guess. A beat of silence followed. I see, Halberton said at last. And what do you imagine his mind holds? That, Lillian replied, is between us. Silence fell again. But this time, it was hers. The second course arrived. Pheasant roasted in wine and herbs, served with glazed carrots and a light truffle sauce. The aroma was rich and subtle. Halberton resumed his line of questioning, but Lillian kept her replies crisp, intelligent, and unyielding. Gabriel said little, but when he did, every word was measured, every silence intentional. Lillian noticed. And so did Lord Halberton. By the time the plates were cleared, the air between the three of them had shifted, not softened, exactly, but recalibrated. Halberton rose first, nodding politely to Lillian. You are not what I expected, Your Grace. Then perhaps it's your expectations that need revising, she replied. When he had gone, Gabriel remained seated, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. He came here to remind me who I used to be, Gabriel said quietly. Lillian's voice was gentle. And is that who you are still? He looked at her, not searching, not testing, just seeing her. No, he said, but I haven't yet decided who that makes me. The drawing room was still warm when Lillian entered it later that evening. A book in her hand, her hair was loosely pinned, with a few soft strands brushing her cheek. Gabriel was already there, standing near the hearth. One hand rested on the mantel, his jacket set aside, shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. She paused in the doorway, surprised he hadn't retired. He didn't turn, but said quietly, Did you mean it? She stepped further in. You'll have to be more specific. At dinner. What you said to Halberton. I don't tend to say things I don't mean. He nodded once. Lillian lowered herself into a nearby chair and set her book aside. You thought I'd fumble. No, he said softly. I thought he'd rattle you. He didn't. I noticed. He moved to the sideboard and poured a measure of brandy into 2 crystal glasses. No flourish, just the quiet clink of glass against decanter. He offered her one. She accepted it without comment, the rim cool against her fingers. Does he want something from you? She asked. Of course. Power? Gabriel settled across from her. Control. She tilted her head. And what do you want? He didn't answer at once. Then, to be left alone. That's not an ambition. That's a retreat. He didn't speak, but something in his posture shifted, as though he'd been seen more clearly than he intended. Silence returned, not strained but thoughtful. The fire crackled low. The air smelled of wood smoke, with a faint trace of brandy and orange peel lingering from the sideboard. After a while, Lillian said, You could have defended me more strongly. Gabriel didn't flinch. You didn't need me to. That's not the same thing. He met her eyes. Would you rather I made a show of it? Raised my voice at the first man who questioned your right to sit at my table? No. Her voice was measured. I'd rather you gave him reason not to ask again. He held her gaze. I'll remember that. She nodded once. Good. When the mantel clock chimed the hour, she rose. But instead of leaving, she crossed to where he sat and offered him the half-finished glass of brandy. He reached for it, and their hands touched, briefly, skin to skin. No apology. No startled withdrawal. He set both glasses aside and stood. I could walk you to your room, he said. Not a command, not obligation, just an offer. She considered it. All right. They left the drawing room side by side. Their steps soft on the carpeted floor. The house hushed around them. They lingered at her door. Lillian turned, one hand lightly upon the knob. Did he unsettle you? Gabriel was quiet a moment before replying. At most, he reminded me of what I left behind. She regarded him. And do you miss it? His gaze settled on her. Not measuring, not guarded. Simply present. No, he said at last. But I have yet to learn how to live without it. Her voice was scarcely above a whisper. Then perhaps I may be of some assistance. She did not wait for his answer. She slipped inside and closed the door with quiet deliberation. Breakfast was laid on the sideboard in the morning room, where sunlight spilled through tall windows and softened even Lord Halberton's sharper edges. Silver-domed dishes held poached eggs, curls of cured ham, and baked tomatoes glistening with butter. A linen-draped basket cradled warm rolls, while a pot of chocolate steamed gently beside a tray of fresh cream and sugar. Lillian arrived first. She greeted the staff with quiet courtesy, poured herself chocolate, and buttered a roll with steady, unhurried hands. When Lord Halberton entered, she rose just briefly. My lord, she said. Your grace, he replied, with that same measured tone that never quite crossed into warmth. He seated himself. You have a gift for appearances. Lillian took a sip of chocolate. Appearances only work if they're convincing. And do you find this one convincing? She glanced at him. If you're asking whether I know my place, yes, I do. Halberton leaned back in his chair. That remains to be seen. Gabriel entered then, coat unbuttoned, hair still slightly damp from his ride. He crossed to the sideboard, fixed a plate and took a seat beside Lillian, without ceremony. Halberton stirred his coffee slowly, his expression one of idle judgment. It's strange to see you like this, he said at last. Ravenscroft Hall, the Sussex air, a quiet domestic routine. I can hardly picture the man I once knew buried under hedgerows and garden paths. Gabriel reached for the rolls, unbothered. You're welcome to leave if the countryside proves too much. Halberton gave a dry smile. Not too much, just unexpected. You were always more precise, focused, driven. A pause. Now you speak of books and gardens, and your charming young Duchess with rather more warmth than I'd have wagered. Gabriel's gaze lifted. Steady, flat, careful, Bertram. Halberton's tone remained smooth. Only an observation. She's lovely, of course. And clever, I've no doubt. But cleverness isn't the same as judgment, especially in a girl raised outside our world. Gabriel set down his cup with deliberate care. Lillian is neither naive nor ornamental. She understands more than half the men who ever advised my father, and speaks plainly because I value truth over pretense. That's not the world we come from, Halberton said. Gabriel regarded him steadily. Then it would seem the time for change is upon us. Halberton inclined his head. You were once more circumspect in choosing your enemies. Gabriel's reply was smooth, but edged. And you, as I recall, were rather too confident in choosing the wrong adversaries. Silence settled between them, cool and taut. If you think my wife has weakened me, Gabriel said calmly, then you've misunderstood us both. Lillian didn't move, didn't blink, but warmth bloomed quietly in her chest, part affection, part something dangerously close to triumph. Halberton, for the first time, said nothing. Later that morning, their guest departed with all the ceremony due to his rank. Gabriel saw him out personally, and Lillian watched from the upstairs window as the barouche rattled down the drive. She expected no discussion, no apology. But when she stepped back from the glass and turned, Gabriel was already in the room. No one would have blamed you for saying nothing, she said quietly. Gabriel met her gaze. That's never been a good enough reason, and yet you chose to speak. She said softly, I chose you. Gabriel crossed to her. Not quickly, not urgently, just deliberately. I've made 1,000 decisions in this house, he said. Most of them alone, most of them right. And me? He paused. You're the only decision I didn't make for the sake of strategy. He stopped just in front of her. Not touching, not reaching, just present. Lillian met his gaze. And now? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer and adjusted the fall of her sleeve, nothing more. His fingers brushed the inside of her wrist, warm against her skin. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back. I'll be in the study, he said, and he left. Lillian remained by the window, her fingers tingling where he had touched her. She had expected coldness. She had braced for indifference. But instead, she had received something far rarer, respect, and perhaps slowly, cautiously, something more. Chapter 6. A Name from the Past. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the garden damp and gold-edged. Leaves clung to branches in dwindling numbers, and the hedgerows stood dark and sharp beneath a scatter of fallen colour. Lillian drew her pelisse tighter against the morning chill. Her bonnet, trimmed in rust ribbon, framed her face, and her boots whispered through the wet leaves. She hadn't meant to go far, only far enough to breathe, to let the hush of autumn settle what the night had stirred. She paused near the yew arch, watching the sun struggle through a veil of copper cloud. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt him. Gabriel's coat brushed softly as he came to stand beside her, gloves in hand, the wind tugging a strand of dark hair loose. He spoke quietly. Out before breakfast, Duchess? Lillian didn't turn. I woke before the sun. You often do. I like the hush, she said. Before the house remembers it has things to prove. He was silent for a moment, then said, I wasn't sure you'd come out this morning. I needed the air, she replied, and perhaps the silence. Did you find either? She gave a small smile. For a little while, they walked in silence, the garden path soft beneath their boots, damp with fallen leaves. The air held that distinct autumn sharpness, wood smoke, earth, and something faintly sweet from the last of the windfall apples. Lillian glanced down as she stepped over a curled amber leaf. I always liked this part of the season, when the leaves go brittle and everything smells like it's being put away. Gabriel looked over at her. Put away? She shrugged, tucked in, like the whole world's ready for a long nap. He gave a faint hum of agreement. We used to rake the lawns into piles when Julian and I were boys. The gardeners hated it. You jumped in them, didn't you? He gave her a side glance. We swore we wouldn't. Every time. She smiled. And did you? Every time. They walked a few more paces in silence, the wind stirring the trees. Lillian glanced up. That maple's still holding on. Gabriel followed her gaze. The red leaves clung to the branches, rustling stubbornly. They always were the last to go, he said. Maybe they're just waiting for someone to notice, she said. He turned to her then, as if seeing something he'd almost missed, and for once he didn't try to answer, just walked beside her, quietly, as the leaves fell around them. You're different out here, Lillian said, her eyes on the path ahead. Away from London, away from all of them. Gabriel kept his gaze forward. Everyone's always watching. Some just pretend not to. I wasn't speaking of them. That slowed him. Just a step. He glanced at her. Does it bother you? She shook her head. No. But it makes me wonder what you lose by staying constantly armored. Gabriel's expression shifted, quiet, unreadable. And what do you lose? He asked. By trying to read what I don't say. Lillian gave a faint smile. Only time. He stopped walking then. Not abruptly, just deliberately. She stopped with him. Gabriel turned to her. You think I married you for silence? Lillian met his gaze. I think you married me because I wouldn't cause a stir. I fit the setting. He studied her. Then I was wrong, he said, because I've rarely met anyone more capable of unsettling a room. She said nothing. His voice dropped, quieter now. It was never peace I required, but someone with the resolve to remain when peace was no longer possible. She didn't look away. And in the hush that followed, sharp and cold, and full of things unsaid, the distance between them hadn't closed, but it had changed. When they returned to the house, the hall greeted them with its usual stillness. A footman stepped forward, carrying a small tray. A letter for Her Grace, he said. Lillian accepted it with a quiet murmur of thanks. The moment she saw the handwriting, she knew. The paper was fine, the seal familiar. But it was the script, elegant, restrained, that brought the past rushing back. Lillian broke it open as Gabriel removed his gloves. Her eyes stilled on the signature, Thomas Fielding. The name struck harder than she expected. She folded the letter carefully, but not before she caught Gabriel's glance flick toward the page in her hand. He'd seen it. Bad news? He asked, voice neutral. No, she said. Old news. He didn't press, but she felt it. How his stillness tightened, how the air between them shifted, and for the first time in weeks, she wondered what her past might look like in his hands, whether he would close his grip or open it. She held the letter longer than necessary. There was no need to read it again. The words were already imprinted in her mind. I returned to London last month. I was told of your marriage. I hope to speak with you, if only to put to rest what was never given the chance to begin. She slipped the letter into her writing desk and closed the lid. When she turned, she found Gabriel standing at the window. He must have stepped in while her back was turned, quietly, without knocking, but not unwelcome. You're quiet, she said. I'm thinking. She crossed the room, stopping a pace or two from him. About the estate? No. A beat. Then, Fielding. I know the name. Her voice stayed even. He was my father's solicitor. A pause. Then quieter. What was he to you? Lillian didn't look away. He asked to marry me. Gabriel's gaze didn't shift. And you accepted? No. I waited. His brow tensed. For what? For certainty, she said. For him, for myself, and did it come? Not in time. He left England without a word, no explanation, just gone. And when I finally did receive a letter over a year later, there was nothing in it worth answering. And now? Now he's returned, and wants to finish what he never began. Gabriel was silent. Then, do you mean to answer him? Lillian reached for the letter, folded it once more, and set it aside. Her voice was steady. If I'd meant to keep it from you, I wouldn't have opened it in your presence. That stopped him. He turned to face her fully now. You said he asked to marry you. She nodded. He did. A pause. And if he were to ask again? Lillian didn't blink. Then he's too late. That landed. She saw it in the quiet shift of Gabriel's shoulders, the slow release of something he hadn't admitted to holding. He stepped forward. Not with urgency, not with demand, just close enough. His hand brushed hers. Lightly, intentionally, not a claim, not a question, just contact. And in that small, wordless moment, it wasn't only trust that passed between them, it was the beginning of belief. Later, Lillian sat at the writing desk once more, the letter open before her, pen in hand. She stared at the blank page for a long time. Then, finally, she wrote, Mr. Fielding, I wish you well on your return to England. But there is nothing between us left to resolve. I am content in the life I have chosen, and I do not regret it. With respect, L.R. She sealed the note and rang for the footman. Please have this sent with the afternoon post. When the door closed behind him, she rested her fingertips on the desk, still and thoughtful. Let it be the last time I hear from him. Not in any obvious way. The clocks still chimed the hour. Footmen passed quietly through the halls, and the air still held the scent of beeswax and fresh bread. But something had changed. There was a new kind of silence between them, not empty, not cold, but open, the kind that could hold things not yet said. Gabriel found her in the small library, just after midday. She sat curled in a velvet chair near the window, a book in her lap, one finger marking a page she hadn't turned in some time. "You never use the East Gallery," he said from the doorway. "I wasn't sure I was meant to," Lillian replied, not looking up from her book. "It's part of the house," he said, his tone even. She closed her book, then met his eyes. "Not all of it feels that way." He paused. "Would you like to see the rest?" Lillian stood, marking her page. "I would." He led her down a quiet corridor, one she'd passed but never entered. At the end, he unlocked a pair of carved double doors. Inside was a music room, bright, still, and gently dust-covered. A pianoforte stood at the far wall beneath a faded cloth. A small harp rested in the corner. The scent of old wood and lemon oil lingered. Lillian stepped in, her voice low. "I thought it would feel haunted." "It isn't," Gabriel said. "Only unused." She approached the piano. "Do you play?" "Not in years." "Would you?" He didn't answer. But after a moment, he sat. What followed wasn't performance. It was memory. Quiet, unadorned, and aching in its simplicity. The notes wove through the stillness like breath in a sealed room. When it ended, he didn't lift his hands from the keys. "That was the last piece Julian ever wrote," he said. Lillian stepped closer, resting her hand on the piano's edge. "It's beautiful." "He never heard it played," Gabriel said. "Not properly. I should have." He stopped, jaw tight. "I should have played it sooner." Her voice was soft. "You've played it now." His gaze lifted to hers, unguarded, and without the armor he usually wore. "I don't know how to live in this house without him." Lillian didn't flinch. "Then let's make it into something new." A pause. He didn't answer. But when she reached out, just briefly, just enough, he let her take his hand. That night, at her door, Gabriel paused, not from doubt, but from the weight of everything he hadn't yet said. "I don't know how to be a husband," he said quietly. "Not the kind you might have hoped for. I was taught duty, distance, appearances. I was never taught this." Lillian didn't look away. "No one teaches the real parts," she said. "You learn them. With someone willing to stay while you do." Then, gently, she opened the door. Just enough. But Gabriel didn't move to cross the threshold. Their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. Not rushed, not refused. He gave a small nod, almost a bow. "Good night," he said softly. Lillian's voice was just as quiet. "Good night." She closed the door, not abruptly, but with care, and he remained on the other side, and waited. Chapter 7. The Preferred Match. The letter was waiting for Gabriel at breakfast. It came on heavy cream stationery, sealed with the crest of Lady Strathmore, and faintly scented with lavender and something sharper beneath it. Authority, perhaps, or expectation. Gabriel broke the seal, scanned the contents, and released a quiet breath that sounded perilously close to resignation. Lillian looked up from her tea. "Bad news?" He folded the letter and set it beside his plate. "Family." She winced faintly. "That does tend to be." A brief sound of amusement escaped him, though it never reached his eyes. "My aunt," he said. "The Dowager Viscountess Strathmore. She has decided to pay us a visit." Lillian lifted a brow. That sort of decision usually comes with notice. "She arrives tomorrow." Lillian set her spoon down with care. "She must be exceedingly fond of you." "She's fond of control," Gabriel replied, "and appearances. She managed my father's social life as if it were a military campaign. And now," Lillian said evenly, "she's turned her attention to yours." Apparently. She waited a moment before asking, "Will you be requesting that I remain out of sight?" "No." He looked at her then. "I'll be asking whether you wish to receive her." That gave her pause. I thought that wasn't my choice. It is now. She considered him for a moment. And if I declined, then I would send her away. The words settled between them. Quiet, unmistakable, not duty, not obligation, a choice. Lillian reached for her teacup. In that case, I'll have the housekeeper prepare the green sweet. He studied her. You're certain? I'm your Duchess, Gabriel, she said calmly. Let her see what that means. The next morning, Bess helped her select a dress of deep sapphire blue, fashioned from fine woolen merino, with a high waistline that fell in graceful folds to the floor. The bodice was gently gathered beneath the bust, with a modest neckline edged in narrow lace, and long-fitted sleeves ending in cuffs delicately embroidered with silver thread. Small self-covered buttons trimmed the front, and a sash of matching fabric tied at the back lent a subtle elegance. It was a gown suited to daylight hours and genteel company, refined, but not ostentatious. Lillian studied her reflection in the long mirror, smoothing a hand down the line of her gown. It's not the most elaborate, she said, her tone thoughtful. No lace, no jewels. Behind her, Bess adjusted the final pin in her hair with steady fingers. No, Your Grace, she said softly. But it doesn't need to be. Lillian glanced at her reflection once more, the deep sapphire wool draped with quiet elegance, silver embroidery glinting at the cuffs. The cut was clean, the shape unadorned but dignified, its simplicity all the more striking for what it chose to withhold. You've worn finer things, Bess said, smoothing the hem, but none that suit you better. Lillian inclined her head. That will do then. She was ready to defend the place she now held. The carriage arrived just past noon, its black lacquer gleaming against the frost like polished jet. The horses, a matched pair of bays, stamped impatiently as steam curled from their muzzles into the brittle winter air. Livery-clad footmen descended from the rear, with practiced efficiency, and one stepped smartly forward to open the door. That morning, Lillian had spoken briefly with Mrs. Price about preparing rooms for the Dowager Countess. There had been no mention of a second guest. Still, when the second trunk was lifted from the boot, and another figure descended the carriage steps with practiced charm, Lillian gave no outward sign of surprise, though Clarissa Tyndale had not been mentioned in the letter, nor had Mrs. Price prepared a second room. That omission, Lillian suspected, was not an oversight, but a message. Lady Strathmore emerged first, descending with the poised deliberation of a woman who had not only practiced such entrances, but had spent a lifetime assuming they were worth observing. Her gown was dove-grey wool, tailored to perfection, and trimmed with a collar of silver fox that gleamed softly in the pale light. A matching muff hung from a silk cord at her wrist, and her hat, wide-brimmed and adorned with a single ostrich feather, was tilted at an angle that suggested both style and authority. She paused at the foot of the carriage step, taking in the house before her with an expression of composed assessment, the faintest lift of her brows conveying a kind of gracious scrutiny, as though she had already found it acceptable, but only just. Following her came Miss Clarissa Tyndale, her golden ringlets escaping artfully from beneath a travelling bonnet trimmed in satin and braid. She wore a close-fitted pelisse of forest green, the velvet collar turned up just so, and her kid gloves were a pale ivory that would not long survive the countryside. Her gaze flicked over the scene with polite interest as she addressed the footman in tones pitched just loud enough to be admired. A voice trained for drawing rooms, shaped to imply charm without invitation. Miss Tyndale had been invited, clearly, but not by anyone in this house. Ostensibly, she had come for the air. But Lillian knew well enough when a guest was also an offering. Together, they made a tableau, winter's elegance in motion, wrapped in wool and velvet and expectation. Gabriel met them at the door. Lillian stood just behind him, hands clasped, posture immaculate, her expression composed. "Aunt," Gabriel said, inclining his head. "Welcome to Ravenscroft." Gabriel. Her voice was cool, touched with the warmth of long acquaintance and the faintest trace of condescension. "How very good of you to have us." He stepped aside. "Allow me to present my wife." Lady Strathmore's smile did not quite reach her eyes. "But of course." She extended one gloved hand with gracious precision. "Your Grace," she said, the honorific delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest it had only recently become habitual. Lillian curtsied with quiet elegance. Lady Strathmore, Miss Tyndale. Clarissa dipped into a curtsy of her own. Eyes bright, mouth sweet. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Your Grace. I've heard so much." "I'm sure you have," Lillian replied, already turning toward the drawing room. Poised, deliberate, and unmistakably in command. Tea had been laid with care, fine porcelain painted with violets, warm scones wrapped in starched linen, preserves and sweetmeats arranged like gems on polished silver. The hearth burned low, perfuming the room with the faint scent of cedar. Gabriel sat near the fire, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other cradling a half-filled teacup. He said nothing as the guests settled, but Lillian could feel his attention, steady as the warmth behind her shoulder. She poured with an unhurried hand. Clarissa accepted her cup with the poise of someone trained in admiration. "What a charming house," she said. "So traditional. It must be quite the adjustment, coming from a more modest life." Lillian stirred her tea once. "Stone is stone. Polished or plain, it holds just the same." Gabriel's gaze shifted, barely, but Lillian felt it. A flicker of something. Amusement, approval, restraint. Lady Strathmore's smile curved, slow and deliberate. "And yet, some homes are built to last. Others are temporary arrangements." Lillian lifted her cup. "That depends entirely on the builder, wouldn't you say?" Clarissa's fingers tightened slightly on her saucer. Not surprise. Not yet. But something close. Gabriel, still silent, sipped his tea. The formal dining room hadn't been used in weeks, but tonight it was lit with crystal sconces and firelight, the table laid with gleaming silver, bone china edged in cobalt, and heavy-stemmed wine glasses. The air smelled of roasted meats and spice, and a subtle tension hung just beneath the scent of cinnamon and clove. Lillian was seated to Gabriel's right. Lady Strathmore sat opposite, Clarissa beside her. Two footmen moved between courses like shadows, and conversation flowed around the table in careful, practiced patterns. The meal was beautiful. Duck glazed with red currant, served with rosemary potatoes, and a delicate watercress soup that smelled faintly of lemon. Clarissa smiled too often. Lady Strathmore not enough. It wasn't until the third course, a delicate venison ragout, that the real performance began. "Of course," the dowager said smoothly, cutting into her meat with surgical grace. "Clarissa's sister married the Marquess of Penfield last spring. The wedding was exquisite. No compromises necessary. You understand." Gabriel's knife paused briefly on his plate. Clarissa dabbed her lips. "They're terribly well suited." "I imagine they are," Lillian said, though appearances are rarely the best measure of compatibility. Clarissa tilted her head. "But surely some shared background helps." "Temperament counts for more," Lillian said, "and that's never assured by birth." Lady Strathmore smiled faintly. "And yet one must ask, how can a woman truly support her husband if she doesn't understand the world he lives in?" Gabriel set down his glass. "She understands more than most," he said, "far more than you give her credit for." Silence followed, not sharp, but solid, the kind of silence that marked a line drawn clean. Clarissa looked down at her plate. Lady Strathmore folded her hands. The conversation drifted, gracefully, to something safer, but the shift had been made. Gabriel had not raised his voice. He had raised her standing, and that, Lillian knew, would echo longer than anything else he could have said. The next morning, the carriage arrived just before 10. The frost had lifted, and a pale ribbon of sunlight ran along the drive, catching the gleam of polished wheels and silver harness buckles. Footmen moved briskly, their breath clouding in the cold, while the final trunk was secured to the rear. Clarissa descended first, green skirts brushing neatly over the steps. Her expression was poised, her farewell measured. Lady Strathmore followed, dignified as ever in dove-grey wool, her presence no less imposing for its silence. Lillian stood just inside the entryway, hands lightly folded before her. She had offered her farewells in the drawing-room, but she lingered now, not out of obligation, but because she understood what the moment required. Gabriel accompanied them to the carriage, exchanging a few final words with the coachman. At the step, Lady Strathmore turned back. "Thank you for receiving us, Your Grace," she said, with a faint inclination of her head. Lillian returned the gesture with quiet warmth. "You are welcome at Ravenscroft." There was no bite, no false sweetness, just courtesy and calm. The older woman nodded once, then climbed in after Clarissa. The door shut with a firm click, and the team pulled forward, hooves striking the gravel in even rhythm. Gabriel turned back as the carriage began to move. His gaze found Lillian's at once, an unspoken tether across the distance. Clarissa saw it. She hesitated at the window, eyes flicking toward them. Her smile didn't quite hold. Lillian stood still until the carriage disappeared behind the hedgerows. Gabriel stepped in beside her, closing the door softly behind him. The hall hushed again. His hand brushed against hers, light, unhurried. A gesture that could have been casual, except that it wasn't. She said nothing, but she didn't move her hand. And that, perhaps, was enough. Chapter 8. A family visit. There was a rhythm to life at Ravenscroft now. It was not romantic, not yet, but it was steady. Lillian and Gabriel shared their meals without strain. Conversation came more easily. The silence between them no longer resembled distance, but something quieter, like rooms with doors left open. He joined her on walks. She joined him in the study. And sometimes, in the stillness of evening, they sat together by the fire, his chair angled toward hers, not by accident. They had not touched again, but they were closer now than they had been on the day they wed. It was just before midday when the letter arrived. Bess brought it in with the post, resting it atop a folded newspaper on Lillian's breakfast tray. The seal was plain, the handwriting familiar. Her breath caught before she even broke the wax. Henry. The tone was cheerful, far too cheerful for a man who had once lost half their inheritance to blind confidence and bad advice. Dearest Lil, forgive the short notice, but I find myself passing near Sussex, and it would be remiss not to call. It's been too long, and you are, after all, now very grand indeed. Just a brief visit. I'll not stay the night unless welcome, only long enough to see that marriage becomes you. Affectionately, and with more sense than you likely expect, Henry. She folded the letter once, then again, and sat with it in her hand for a long time. The tone was light, the handwriting familiar, but the timing too neat. No man passed near Sussex by accident. He said it wasn't about money, but then, he always said that, and sometimes she had believed him. Gabriel was in the study, seated near the window, a ledger open before him. He looked up when she entered. "You're pale." "I've had a letter." He nodded once, and waited. "My brother Henry. He's passing through. He asks to visit." Gabriel leaned back slightly, closing the ledger with one hand. "For how long?" "He says, only a day." "And what does he want?" Lillian hesitated. "I don't know." One dark brow lifted. "But I believe him when he says it isn't money." Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Measured, unreadable. "I won't stop him," he said. Lillian nodded. "I didn't think you would." He met her gaze. "If you believe it's not money, I'll believe you." She gave a small, grateful nod. "But if he gives you cause for doubt, I'll know," she said. Gabriel inclined his head and said nothing more. That evening, she stood at her mirror, longer than usual. She had chosen a gown of soft grey wool, modest in cut but impeccably made. The high waist was gathered beneath the bust with a narrow satin ribbon, and the long sleeves ended in cuffs, edged with whitework embroidery. A single pearl clasp fastened at the collar, the only ornament she allowed. No jewels, no silks, no bright colours, only quiet elegance. It was a gown for someone with nothing to prove and everything to hold. Dependable, her mother might have said. And now, more than ever, she wished to appear precisely that. She studied her reflection, shoulders back, gaze steady, and said aloud very softly, "He's only Henry. He can't undo what I've built." And she believed it, almost. Henry arrived the next afternoon in a hired carriage that looked as though it had seen better decades. The paint was chipped, the wheel rims rusted, and the driver gave the impression of having been paid in promises. Henry stepped down with a flourish, coat flapping, smile wide. Lillian crossed the drive at once. "Henry," she said, reaching for a brief embrace. He smelled faintly of cologne, expensive but faded. His boots were clean, but the soles were nearly worn through. The coat was good cloth, but poorly tailored and clearly second-hand. And his hat, far too jaunty for the countryside, tilted at just the sort of angle that dared you to notice. Still, he looked well, brighter than she remembered. She stepped back, composed. "You're late, and you're married," he said, offering an exaggerated bow, to a duke no less. "I see you've been busy." Before she could reply, Gabriel appeared at the top of the steps. Henry straightened immediately. "Ah, the husband, your Grace." He extended a hand. "Henry Hartley." Gabriel took it briefly. "Welcome to Ravenscroft." Lillian did not miss the pause that followed. Short, quiet, but weighted. Then Gabriel turned to her. "Will you be in the drawing room?" "If you'd like company." His reply was quiet, but steady. "I would." She gave a nod, the smallest curve of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Then, yes, I'll join you shortly." She took Henry's arm lightly, and together they entered the house. The drawing room was warm, the fire lit, a tray of tea and sandwiches prepared. Henry collapsed onto the settee as if he owned it. "Well," he said, glancing around, "you've done rather well for yourself, Lil." Gabriel remained standing. "My wife has adapted quickly. She carries the name better than most born to it." Lillian glanced at him briefly, but not without gratitude. Henry grinned. "That sounds like praise. You always this generous, Your Grace." Gabriel lifted a brow, "Only when it's earned." Tea was poured. Conversation wandered. Henry spoke of London, passing acquaintances, a cousin ruined by a racehorse and redeemed by scandal. His stories were amusing but shallow. He asked no questions. He didn't notice the stillness in Gabriel's posture, or the way Lillian's hand tensed when he spoke their father's name. And each time the topic edged toward money, Lillian's spine grew a little straighter. She watched him carefully, waited for the ask. It never came. But his stories strayed close enough. At dinner the distance grew. Henry chatted through each course: roast lamb, steamed greens, a tart of quince and sweet onion. He complimented the cook, joked with the footman, and mentioned a peer he'd once met at a tavern near Pall Mall. Gabriel spoke only when required. Lillian smoothed every moment with ease, but her eyes dulled as the evening wore on. Henry refilled his own glass without waiting for the footman. "You've trained your staff a little too well, Ashbourne. They hardly blink when I misbehave." Gabriel didn't look up. "They've learned to ignore spectacle." Henry turned to Lillian, grinning. "Tell me, Your Grace, does he ever smile when it's just the two of you? Or is that reserved for state occasions and funerals?" There was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Later, he leaned back in his chair. "You know, I was recently approached by a gentleman our father used to know. Investment opportunity. Perfectly sound." I said no, of course. But it did make me think of what might have been. The room stilled. Gabriel set down his knife with care. Lillian spoke first. "What might have been," she said evenly, "is no longer relevant." Henry blinked. "Of course. Just conversation, that's all. The meal continued, but something beneath it had shifted. Henry swirled his wine, eyes dancing. You'll be flattered to hear I used your name at White's last week, Ashbourne. The wager was questionable, but your reputation, well, impeccable as ever. Gabriel didn't look up. I trust you lost. Henry grinned. Only the bet. The room fell awfully quiet when I mentioned your name. Quite useful, really. He turned to Lillian with mock innocence. Do you mind terribly, Your Grace? A fellow has to dine somehow. She dabbed her lips with her napkin. I dare say the Duke's name was not meant to serve as collateral. Henry's grin widened. Ah, but it's such sturdy collateral, and dreadfully well bred. She didn't return the smile. Then perhaps you should try earning a reputation of your own. Gabriel reached for his glass, silent but faintly amused, and Lillian felt the moment settle between them like an unspoken accord. Later, in her room, Lillian removed her earrings slowly. Bess stood behind her, unpinning her hair. Did you know he was coming, Your Grace? The maid asked softly. Yes, Lillian replied. Bess hesitated, then offered gently. He means well. Lillian met the maid's eyes in the mirror. I know, she said, but sometimes that isn't enough. Gabriel found her in the library. The candles had burned low. The hearth was dark. A shawl lay about her shoulders, and a cup of tea sat cooling beside her, untouched. Henry had taken his leave just after dinner, with a careless bow and a vague promise to write, though neither of them expected much from it. The house had quieted quickly in his absence, as if relieved. Gabriel closed the door behind him. No announcement, no wasted motion. You're angry with him, he said. Lillian didn't lift her gaze. No, disappointed, then. Not even that, she murmured, just not surprised, and still wishing I were. He said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed to the hearth and struck a match against the marble. The fire caught slowly, warm light spreading across the carpet, brushing the lines of her face, the quiet curve of her hand. I know what it is, he said softly, to care for someone who cannot be trusted with the weight of that care. That made her look up. He met her eyes. Julian was brilliant, Gabriel said. Charming, impossible, beloved by all the wrong people. He left things unfinished, unspoken, and when he died, the wreckage nearly ruined this estate. No will, no ledgers. I sold half the silver and 3 of the best horses to keep the staff paid. Lillian's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't tell you. She hesitated. Why now? He stepped toward her, slow and certain. I watched you stand before my aunt and never lower your eyes. And tonight you protected your brother, not by lying, but by telling the truth no one else dared say. He stopped in front of her. Close now. I have had enough of things left unsaid. Lillian, I don't want that between us. She rose, steady. They stood a breath apart. Then don't ask me to pretend, she said quietly. Not for your family, and not for mine. I won't. Her hand was still at her side, until he reached for it. His fingers closed around hers gently, without insistence, and this time she stepped toward him. Not from duty, not by accident, but because she chose to. His other hand came to rest at her waist. Light, certain, anchoring, she spoke again, just above the fire's quiet crackle. You said once you couldn't promise affection. I did, and now? He looked at her mouth, but only for a moment, then back at her eyes. I still cannot promise it, he said, but I can no longer pretend it isn't there. She drew in one breath, and then she rose onto her toes and kissed him. Unhurried, steady, without question. It was not passion. Not yet. It was something rarer. It was trust, and he let it be. Chapter 9. Terms of the Future. The room was quiet, not with the silence of distance, or cold, or restraint, but the gentler kind. The kind made of low light, shared breath, and bedsheets tangled between 2 sleeping bodies. Lillian stirred first. She was warm, and comfortably so. Her cheek rested in the crook of an arm, not her own. Her hand curled loosely against a chest that rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Gabriel. She didn't open her eyes. She only breathed in, savouring the quiet certainty of waking as his wife, in truth, for the very first time. He smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen, something warm and unmistakably masculine. It was not the first time they had touched, but it was the first time she had been held, truly held. One of his hands rested at her back, light and unmoving, as though he'd placed it there without thinking, as though it belonged there. She shifted slightly, and his arm tensed, not to pull her closer, but to keep her from slipping away. She smiled against his skin. "You're awake," Gabriel said, his voice rough with sleep. "I am." He didn't move. "How long?" "A few minutes. Maybe longer. I didn't hear you. You weren't meant to," she murmured. Gabriel exhaled slowly through his nose. His thumb brushed once along the small of her back, beneath the edge of the sheet. It wasn't suggestive, just steadying. "You don't regret it?" he asked. No, she tilted her face toward his shoulder. "Do you?" "I'd regret not waking up like this." That surprised her. Not the words themselves, but the ease in them. No mask, no distance, just truth. She shifted again, lifting her gaze to him, her hand resting lightly over his heart. His eyes were open now, still heavy with sleep, but steady. "You're quieter in the mornings," she said, her voice low. "The armor takes time," he replied. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I prefer you without it." He was silent for a moment. "Then let this be where we begin." Eventually, she rose. The hour could not be held off forever, and Bess would be waiting. But when she left his bed, it was not with haste, and it was not with doubt. She left as a woman no longer waiting to be chosen, but as one who had been quietly, irrevocably welcomed into his life. That afternoon, in the study, Gabriel unfolded the estate ledger. A note from his steward lay atop the page, brief, precise and clear. Larkhall Estate may be sold by spring. Orphanage may not survive. His brow furrowed. Outside, the corridor was quiet, until a soft knock sounded at the door. Lillian stepped in, a faint crease between her brows. "I heard one of the maids mention Larkhall," she said, "something about the school, and the orphanage losing funding." She hesitated. "Are you thinking of selling it?" Gabriel didn't answer at once. He looked down at the ledger, then back up at her, and when he spoke, the air between them felt different than it had that morning. The estate council convened in a long panelled chamber just off the south wing, a room that smelled faintly of old paper, beeswax and ink. Lillian had never entered it before. The men inside paused as she crossed the threshold behind Gabriel. 6 of them sat around the table. Trustees, stewards, legal advisors. Most were older. All wore the mild surprise of men unaccustomed to seeing a duchess at a land meeting. She didn't flinch. Gabriel pulled out the chair beside his and gave a single nod. "Gentlemen," he said, "you know my wife." There were murmurs of greeting. Polite, guarded. Lillian inclined her head and took her seat. The meeting began. Ledgers were opened, reports read aloud. The conversation moved from tenants' repairs to harvest yields, to the outstanding accounts from the wool merchants in Sussex. Lillian listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't posture. She observed quietly, fully, and when a steward mentioned the proposed sale of the Larkhall estate, she turned a page in her own copy of the reports and asked a single question: how many families would be displaced? The steward hesitated, then answered, 14, not including the children housed by the orphanage trust. Lillian looked to the solicitor seated 2 chairs down. And the trust? How long would its funds last, if the land were sold? He cleared his throat. 6 months, at most. She nodded, then folded her hands. Then I'd ask the board to consider alternatives before any vote is taken. Consolidating unused acreage near the West Orchard, adjusting lease terms on the parcels under Lord Fenshire's name. There are options here. A pause followed. Then Gabriel said simply, "She's not wrong." That was enough. The room shifted, quietly, but unmistakably, and when the discussion resumed, it did so with her still at the table, not as an ornament, not as an exception, but as someone who now belonged there. Later, in the corridor outside, Gabriel fell into step beside her. You surprised them, he said. That wasn't my intention. He gave a small nod. Which is precisely why you did. They walked a few paces in silence. Then he added, You were right to ask about Lark Hall. She glanced over. Are you considering other options? Difficult. Yes. Impossible. We shall see. They reached the doors that led to the main hall. Lillian paused. It may not be the life I was born to, but I have no fear of meeting it. Gabriel's gaze held hers. I never imagined you were. She allowed herself a small smile, quiet but true. Later that evening, the fire in Gabriel's study had burned low. Only a single lamp remained lit on the side table, casting a pool of soft light across the rows of closed books and the untouched brandy at his elbow. The estate ledger still lay open, but he wasn't reading it. He sat back in his chair, gaze fixed on the fire, on the flicker of its glow, and the slow dance of shadows against the hearth. When Lillian appeared in the doorway, she did not knock. She did not need to. I did not mean to press you this morning, she said, her voice quiet. About Lark Hall. Gabriel looked up. You did, he said, and you were right to do so. She stepped fully into the room, crossing the threshold, like one with every right to enter, and she did not hesitate. May I know what you've decided? He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely on the arms. I spoke with the steward, he said. Lark Hall will remain part of the estate. The tenants will stay, and the orphanage will be funded directly through Ravenscroft, at least until a more permanent arrangement can be made. Lillian did not speak at once. Then, thank you. Gabriel's voice was low. Don't thank me. The outcome is yours. I merely put my name to it. She moved toward the hearth, pausing beside his chair. Firelight gilded the edge of her gown, catching gently on her cheekbone. I was not raised for this, she said. Not for councils, not for ledgers or land. But as I told you, I do not fear it. I know, he said. I saw it. A pause followed, unhurried but full. Then he added, I've carried this place alone for years. Managed it, answered for it. All of it. And now, she asked, softly. Gabriel rose. He did not take her hands. He did not draw her close. He simply looked at her, as if seeing her wholly for the first time. Now I believe it is something we might build together. Lillian did not smile at once. She stepped forward and reached for his hand. I do not wish to be a symbol, she said quietly, nor anyone's solution. You are neither, he replied. Then what am I? He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. You are mine, he said, and I am yours. If you will have me. Her expression softened, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. She stepped closer, her voice just above a whisper, my love. And then, without ceremony, they came together, not in passion, not in urgency, but in something far steadier, understanding, devotion, a future, quietly, deliberately claimed. After a moment, Gabriel's hand slid gently into hers. His tone was warm, dry with humour, but edged with affection. May I escort you to our chambers, Your Grace? Lillian smiled, softly, but without hesitation. You may. She rose and placed her hand in his, and as they stepped from the firelit hush of the library, it felt less like leaving something behind, and more like stepping into something begun. Chapter 10. The Quiet Victory. The invitation arrived on a square of pale ivory card, thick as pressed linen and edged in gold. The seal was unmistakable, Lady Strathmore's crest, pressed into silver wax with sharp, elegant precision. A serpent curled through a coronet. Gabriel found it in the Morning Post and said nothing for a long while after reading it. Lillian glanced up from her tea. Bad news? He held up the card between two fingers. A summons. She recognized the seal and gave a dry smile. Your aunt. He nodded once. She's hosting a ball. At Halston House. Lillian set her cup down carefully. And we're invited? She calls it a reintroduction, he said, which is her way of saying we're the spectacle. Lillian arched a brow. Was I ever presented as anything other than a curiosity? No, Gabriel said, and she is keenly aware of it. He set the invitation aside. This is her way of making up for the oversight. Lillian did not reply at once. She only lifted her cup again, unhurried, her expression composed. If she felt apprehension, she did not allow it to show. When she looked up, her gaze was steady, not defiant, not uncertain, simply resolved. That evening, as the house quieted around them, Gabriel found her in her chambers. The fire had been banked low. A single lamp burned on the dressing table, casting soft golden light over the polished wood and pale silk of the room. Lillian sat near the window in a cushioned chair, her dressing gown wrapped neatly at the waist, a book open but untouched in her lap. She looked up when he entered, but did not rise. "You're thinking about the ball," he said. "Not with dread," she replied, "if that's what you're worried about." "I'm not," he said, "not anymore." He stepped further into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. In his hand was a small lacquered box. "I meant to give you this some time ago." He held it out. She set the book aside and accepted the box without a word, opened it carefully. Inside lay a necklace, garnets the colour of vintage claret, framed in delicate gold filigree and seed pearls. It was striking and bold, elegant in a way that ignored fashion entirely. Her breath caught, just slightly. "I had it commissioned after the Trenwith ball," Gabriel said quietly. "You wore garnet that night too." Lillian traced one of the stones with a fingertip. "It's yours." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Gabriel." The words faltered. They wouldn't come. He crossed to her at once, gently taking her hands. He said softly, "You'll do them justice, my love." Behind them, the fire crackled, quiet and steady, and for a moment nothing remained between them but love and the quiet grace of understanding. The next morning, they departed for London. The weather held fair, and the roads were clean enough for the carriage to make good time. They arrived at Wyndham House by late afternoon, greeted by polished brass fixtures, familiar staff, and the subtle hum of the city pressing in from beyond the windows. A fire had already been lit in Lillian's dressing room. The garnet necklace lay waiting on her vanity, and tomorrow she would wear it. Proof of Gabriel's belief in her, for all the world to see. Holston House blazed with light. Its chandeliers dripped crystal. Its walls were hung with gold silk and gilt-framed portraits, and every mirror had been polished until it shimmered like water. The air smelled of beeswax, roses and expensive perfume, the kind with foreign names and English pride. The orchestra played a lively waltz. Couples spun across the floor in pale pastels and powdered satin. Jewels glittered at necklines. Fans fluttered in gloved hands. And expressions said, "Look at me," and more importantly, "Look at who's looking at me." Lillian stepped into that glittering chaos without hesitation, Gabriel beside her. The room shifted, not all at once, but enough. Heads turned, fans stilled, conversations paused, just long enough for whispers to take root. Lady Strathmore greeted them beneath the grand staircase. Her gown was silver moiré, her hair stiff with pearls. Her smile was precise, and her eyes sharp. "Gabriel," she said, with an approving nod. "You're only 5 minutes late, practically prompt by your standards." He bowed with the faintest edge of humour. "We wouldn't dare miss the spectacle." Lillian's gown was a striking shade of deep claret, rich as vintage wine and cut to command attention. The silk clung elegantly to her frame. The bodice structured but not severe, with a square neckline edged in black beading that caught the candlelight like tiny stars. Her sleeves were short, her shoulders bare beneath a velvet wrap the colour of midnight. A row of seed pearls traced the waist, subtle and refined, while the skirt fell in smooth, deliberate folds to the floor, moving with a whisper rather than a rustle. She wore no tiara, no feathers, only the garnet necklace Gabriel had given her, bold and unmistakably hers. She did not look like someone trying to belong. She looked like someone who had already claimed her place. "Absolutely. And your grace," the dowager added, turning to Lillian. "You do wear that colour with conviction." Lillian's fingers brushed lightly, almost absently, against the garnet necklace at her throat. "Thank you," she said smoothly. "It's useful, when one needs armour." Lady Strathmore's gaze flicked to the necklace, just for a breath. Her smile thinned but didn't break. Clarissa appeared a few moments later, resplendent in white silk and gold embroidery, her blonde hair arranged in a coronet of braids. She was on the arm of the Marquess of Densbury's son, but her gaze was fixed entirely on Gabriel. She dipped into a curtsy, deferential in posture, but edged with quiet defiance. "Your Grace," she said to Lillian, voice smooth as silk. "I hadn't expected to see you in town quite so soon." Lillian returned the curtsy with composed civility. "I hadn't planned on it either, but the invitation was rather persuasive." Gabriel's mouth twitched, just slightly. Clarissa's gaze swept the crowd with polite detachment. What a refreshing guest list. So many unexpected names. Lillian tilted her head, her smile gracious but cool. A well-curated room always allows for a surprise or two. The next hour unfolded like a lesson in restraint. Lillian moved through the crowd with Gabriel at her side. He introduced her sparingly, but meaningfully. She curtsied where expected. She responded when addressed. She didn't chase conversation. She didn't flatter. She didn't flinch. The tension peaked during a lull between dances. Lady Strathmore stood near a column of marble, fanning herself slowly, surrounded by a half-circle of well-dressed women whose smiles were just a touch too polished. As Lillian passed nearby, one of the ladies leaned in and murmured, "Quite composed, isn't she, considering the circumstances of her upbringing?" Lady Strathmore's fan stilled for a moment. Then, coolly, "She carries herself with more poise than most women born to it. And I dare say Gabriel has never looked better." A few of the ladies blinked. One shifted uncomfortably. Lillian paused, just long enough to meet the dowager's gaze across the small distance between them. Lady Strathmore inclined her head, ever so slightly. Not invitation, not challenge. Recognition. Gabriel, standing just beyond the crowd, caught the exchange, and he smiled. Lillian spotted Lady Evangeline near the far end of the ballroom, silver-gowned, glass in hand, laughter glinting like crystal. Their eyes met, just for a moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. This time, Evangeline looked away first, and something in the room shifted permanently. The musicians tuned their strings for the final waltz. Candles had burned low in their sconces. The air was warm now, heavy with roses, candle wax, and the last traces of champagne. A few guests had already begun to slip away, older ladies in pearls and feathers, young men unsteady on their feet, the shine of the evening fading gently to haze. Lillian stood near a wide archway, one hand resting on the back of a carved chair. There was an air of quiet confidence get shown through her fatigue that came from knowing she had managed the evening on her own terms. She felt Gabriel approach before he spoke. Then, just behind her, "You carried the night." Lillian turned, surprised by the simplicity of the words, and by how much they mattered. She met his eyes. "Thank you, my darling. I'm glad you think so." Gabriel's voice was quiet, but certain. "Everyone thinks so." He extended his hand. "Dance with me." She hesitated for a breath. Not from nerves, but from knowing what it would mean. Not for the ballroom. For them. Then, Lillian placed her hand in his. Gabriel led her to the floor, where the orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz. Slow, elegant, unhurried. He held her with grace, measured, courtly. One hand at her waist, the other enclosing hers, steady and sure. Their eyes met as they turned, step by effortless step. But there was nothing formal about the way he looked at her. The moment wasn't mannered. It was intimate, undeniably, quietly full. Around them the ballroom softened, not in silence, but in attention. Conversations dimmed. Movements slowed. They were not the only couple on the floor, but they were the only two the room remembered. Then, as they turned again beneath the chandelier's soft gleam, Gabriel leaned in, just enough for his breath to warm her ear. "I cannot wait to have you to myself," he murmured, "where no one else is watching." Lillian's breath caught, not in shock, but in pleasure. Her cheeks flushed, faintly but unmistakably, and just like that, a ripple moved through the room. Not scandal, not outrage, something closer to fascination. The aloof Duke of Ravenscroft hadn't simply fallen in love, he had surrendered to it, and everyone saw. Society, curious, skeptical and jaded, watched the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft and said nothing at all, because there was, at last, nothing left to say. That night, as the carriage slipped through the lamplit hush of London, Lillian let her tired head rest against Gabriel's shoulder, in quiet, contented peace. Outside, the city whispered. Inside, his hand found hers. And this time, it wasn't about duty or appearances. It was about choosing one another. Epilogue. Under a starlit sky, 1 year later, Ravenscroft Hall. The rooftop terrace was quiet, lit only by the stars and the low flicker of lanterns along the balustrade. Summer air drifted warm across the Sussex hills, carrying the scent of wild thyme and fresh earth. Below, the house had settled into sleep, but above the sky remained very much awake, brilliant and watchful. Lillian stepped into the open air slowly, one hand resting at the small of her back, the other protectively cradling the curve of her stomach. She was beginning to show now, just enough that her gowns needed letting out, just enough that Gabriel watched her a little more closely each day. He was already on the terrace, standing beside a long brass telescope newly installed on a carved wooden mount. She smiled as she approached. "You brought me all the way up here," she murmured with a smile. "To see the stars?" Her voice held more wonder than teasing, quiet amusement wrapped in affection. Gabriel turned at the sound, and for a moment he simply looked at her, the lantern light glinting in her hair, the soft curve of her growing belly beneath her wrap, the grace she now carried as naturally as breath. "I wanted to give you something," he said. "Something lasting." Her gaze shifted to the telescope, its brass fittings gleaming in the moonlight. She stepped closer, curiosity blooming across her face. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "And so very like you," she smiled then, a quiet curve of her lips. "This is the most elegant stargazing walk I've ever been taken on." "I had it made for you," he said quietly, "after you told me you used to climb the orchard wall at night just to see the sky." Lillian blinked, then smiled. "You remembered that." "I remember everything," he said. She moved closer, letting him wrap an arm around her waist carefully, protectively. Their child shifted inside her, a soft flutter she still wasn't used to. A secret promise, half-formed and already changing everything. "What will we tell them?" she asked after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they're old enough to ask where we began." Gabriel looked down at her, his voice steady. "That we met by accident, and stayed by choice." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the clean night air, the scent of him, the quiet certainty of now. "I didn't know I could be this happy," she said. "I hoped you would be," he replied. "I intend to keep proving it." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, both of their hands resting gently atop the growing swell of her belly. Above them, the stars shimmered like blessings unspoken. And below, the life they were building stretched out before them, steady, strong, and entirely theirs, not born of obligation, not fashioned by society, but chosen, and at last, deeply, truly shared. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. New tales drop every Tuesday, or on Sundays, if you're one of the clever people who've tapped the join button. If you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, you can tap that thanks button right below. It's far less scandalous than slipping coins into a reticule. I'll be back soon with another story, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.